Welcome, everybody, at home and here at Temple Beth Israel. I'm Abby Gershenson. Thank you for joining us tonight for our Toolbox for Aging series. This is a reminder that if anybody does have a cell phone on, to please silence it. Thank you. The series was organized by the Social Services Committee of the Jewish Federation of Lane County, and it's co-sponsored by Temple Beth Israel. The series is intended to cover vital topics of interest to our Jewish community as we age. Tonight's session, Jewish Views on Death and Dying, is presented by Rabbi Ruchi Motzkin-Rubenstein, the rabbi of Temple Beth Israel. The rabbi will discuss Jewish rituals and end-of-life choices, and the session will cover Jewish ritual aspects of approaching death, Jewish end-of-life choices, and some of the history and text behind them. And there is, for those of you at home, there is a handout, and I'm assuming that will be put. It is already posted on the YouTube link. Thank you. So the rabbi will also discuss grief and mourning rituals. Please join us for our final presentation of the series, which is next week, same time, right here on the YouTube channel. We are going to hear about hospice care. That'll be presented by Kim Dunn from Brighton Hospice, and the role of Chevra Kadisha, which will be presented by Libby Botero and Gary Tepfer. And thank you, Michael Griffel and John, for volunteering to stream this on the TBI YouTube channel. Rabbi Ruchi Sophia Motzkin-Rubenstein became TBI's rabbi in July of 2015. I can't believe it's been that long. After graduating from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, it's been wonderful, and it's going on. While completing her studies, she served for 2 years as a Cooperberg Ritmaster Rabbinical intern at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, New York's LGBTQ synagogue. She also interned with the Woodstock Jewish Congregation, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society of Pennsylvania, that's HIAS, and Green Faith, a New Jersey-based environmental organization. She also spent a year in Jerusalem through the New Israel Fund, Shatil Fellowship, and received chaplaincy training through the Clinical Pastoral Education Program at the Jewish Theological Seminary in placement as a hospice chaplain. It's my pleasure to bring you our rabbi, Rabbi Ruchi Sophia Motzkin-Rubenstein. Abby, I think you just took my copy of the handout. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you to the Jewish Federation of Lane County, and particularly the Social Services Committee, for pulling together this series. I think it's really important, and I often get questions from our members about issues of death and dying, end-of-life care, end-of-life choices, and mourning rituals. So I'm glad to be able to share some thoughts with a wide audience and not just one-on-one catch as catch can. I hope this series will continue to remain a resource for even the people who are not able to watch it live, but those who want to access these resources after the fact. So just a note about the handouts. For those here in person, I apologize. They accidentally printed much smaller print with much wider margins than I intended. So if you have trouble seeing them, go ahead later and you can download from the YouTube link probably an easier to read version. And we'll do what we can, those of us in person this evening. So we have a bit of a formidable task this evening to talk both about approaching death, and mourning rituals. But I thought it might be helpful if I started with 2 questions that I often get and some of the texts behind the ways that I answer those questions. So the 2 questions that I get are about the Jewish approach to death with dignity and about what happens to the body afterwards, appropriate Jewish choices for what to do with the body. And since we're Jews, it may not be surprising that the answers to both of those questions are complicated. And I'm not going to give you absolutes, but I can tell you a little, but I wanted to share some of the text and some of the traditional evolution of the Jewish discourse around those questions, as well as what my policies, TBI's policies are personally. So you can open, or if you are here in person, look at the document titled Approaching Death and Afterwards, Jewish End-of-Life Choices, and we'll study a little text together if you're interested. So first, I want to talk about the question of death with dignity, and say, at its bluntest, Judaism does not recognize a right to die. I'm going to temper that in a moment, but a lot of the discourse that we'll see coming out of Jewish poskim, Jewish legal advisors around this question, are going to start with that premise, that our lives do not belong entirely to ourselves. Our lives are an act of grace, an act of will of the divine. Our bodies are in the divine image, and as such, we have a certain responsibility that just extends beyond what our personal desires might be to honor the image of God that we are made in, and not to hasten death. The most common proof texts that are cited for this idea are, of course, from Genesis chapter 1, when it says human beings are made in the image of God, as well as this verse that I have on the sheet from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, that you and your offspring will live. Uvacharta v'chaim, choose life, is framed as a mitzvah, as a commandment, an instruction. That said, as I said, everything is a little bit complicated. And so this text from Ketubot, from the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Ketubot, describing the death of Yehuda Hanasi, illustrates some of the human complications that make it not absolute. And I see some of the people here in person nodding and smiling that perhaps you are familiar with this story. You are welcome to look at it as I summarize it. I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but it is the story of the exilarch, the leader of the Jewish community, as he is on his deathbed. All of the sages gather and pray for him to recover and pray for him not to die. And he has a humble maidservant who's watching this all play out, and she adds her prayers to the prayers of the mighty rabbis, and she says, it looks like the upper worlds, meaning heaven, and the lower worlds, meaning us, are at war with each other over the soul of Yehuda Hanasi, and may the lower world prevail. And then she looks more closely, and she sees that the rabbi's actually in a great deal of pain. And he has to go to the bathroom so many times and put on and take off his tefillin so many times, and that he's actually quite miserable. And so she changes her prayer, and she says, may it be God's will that the upper worlds, that heaven defeats the prayers of the lower worlds. May it be God's will that his soul be released from this suffering. But the rabbi's prayers are so strong that he continues to live, and she goes onto the roof and tosses a clay jug onto the flagstones below, and the shattering of the jug jars the rabbis out of their prayers for a moment, and when they stop praying, they give Yehuda Hanasi's soul a chance to depart. So there's a couple things I love about this story. One is I think it's very illustrative of a truth that I have witnessed, and probably others have witnessed, about people who are ready to die, which is that often when there are people in the room who are not ready for them to die, they don't die. And that it often takes a moment of peace and quiet and privacy for a soul to depart, unless the people in the room with the person on their deathbed have really fully given their permission and explicitly said, we love you, you can go, it's okay. So we see that sociological reality kind of playing out in the subtext of this story. And the other piece that this story shows is sort of the limits of uvacharta v'chaim. At a certain point, forcing someone to remain alive is no longer considered a high moral good. And the story moves on with the announcement of the death of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and how that got handled. It doesn't actually explicitly judge for bad or for good the actions of the maidservant, but the record of this person having this impulse and it taking this impulse to allow a person to die, I think is just very illustrative of sort of the complexity of our tradition, the psychological nuance of acknowledging, we value life as a Jewish tradition, and sometimes that is not to the benefit of a person who is struggling to die. And so we'll see in contemporary discourse about this, exceptions, ideas that a person who is dying, cannot be deprived of certain life-sustaining treatments, but if they have made the request, we can stop feeding them. A person who is dying cannot be deprived of life-sustaining treatments, but if they are uncomfortable, we can give them whatever is required to get them as comfortable as possible. And so in those buts, we have a gray area that allows a lot of nuance for what people need. On your halachic vocabulary, on the other document I gave you, Jewish vocabulary around end of life and mourning, the second item on this list, goses is how it's pronounced, is a dying person in their final moments or days of life as their body begins to shut down. And in halachic literature, it is also sort of permitted to hasten the death of someone once they are in the state of goses. However, in contemporary times, it becomes less easy to find what that is. In classical literature, a goses would be someone who's been injured, got a belly wound in a war and their internal organs are spilling out and you really know they're gonna die within hours. Nowadays with modern medicine, that specific situation may still exist sometimes, but we have a lot of people in grayer area, longer, more protracted, liminal phases between life and death, and so it's not as clear when we can say that someone who is really ill with a degenerative disease, for example, has reached the status of goses. But again, this is not to give you definitive answers, but just to show where the gray areas in the Jewish tradition kind of play out and allow some individual choice, some discretion around what the communal norms may be. I'm going to pause there and see if people want to share reflections or questions about this. Mike? Yeah, someone being eligible for a hospice diagnosis, which is generally a prognosis of less than 6 months left to live, is not at the level of goses. That's an interesting question. I have not actually, I'm sorry. The question was, how does the status of goses get determined? Is it a doctor who says this person is goses? Is it a rabbi who says it? I don't know the answer. There may be halachic literature about this that I am not aware of, but from what I have read, it seems like it's obvious, like they're going to die today. Are there any questions coming in over the YouTube chat? Okay, we do have someone, if you're watching remotely, we do have someone moderating on YouTube. So if you want to put a question in the chat, there will be a little bit of a lag, but I will get it, and Michael Griffel, who is running the streaming, will share it with me. Okay, let's talk about the other big question that I get frequently, which is some variation of, what should I do with my body? Or my loved one wants to do this thing with their body and I'm not sure how I feel about it. And I hear this in a bunch of different directions. You know, for example, a loved one wants to be cremated, or I want to be cremated, and what does Judaism say about that? Or will you officiate for me? And I also hear, I really want to be buried, but it seems hard to justify the expense, or it seems hard to justify the environmental impact, and sounds like cremation is better, and, you know, Rabbi, talk me into or out of this one way or the other. So this too is complicated. I will say, I'll skip a little bit and say, in the mainstream halachic, as in Jewish legal discourse, it's not complicated. Burial is required by mainstream Jewish halachic authorities. Other forms of dealing with the bodies of the dead are not considered legitimate forms from a Jewish perspective. Those being nowadays the most common foil to burial is cremation. Probably at the time that the halachic literature was first being formulated, according to one of my teachers, Rabbi Ethan Tucker, it was not in distinction to cremation, but in distinction to an ancient Zoroastrian process called sky burial, where bodies would be left out on a mountaintop for vultures to be picked over. And so the Jewish literature about mandating burial is specifically militating implicitly against that, which comes back to, what do we do with an image of God? How do we treat an image of God? The proof text that gets cited, usually around requiring burials, is actually a very curious text because it has to do with the treatment of the body of a criminal who is liable for the death penalty. And we can see this on the bottom of the first page of the Approaching Death and Afterwards handout. If a person is guilty of a capital offense and is put to death and you hang them on a tree, you must not let their corpse remain on the stake overnight, but must bury them the same day. For an impaled body is an affront to God. You shall not defile the land that Hashem your God is giving you to possess. So that phrase, you must bury them, ki kavor tikbarenu, we have this repetition of the root kuf bet resh, meaning to bury. And whenever a biblical text has the repetition of the root twice in a row, it's an intensifier of the commandment, you must bury them. That phrase, you must bury them, becomes sort of the proof text of burying is what we do with our dead. However, as Rabbi Ethan Tucker, whom I just referenced, quotes in a really wonderful Responsa Radio segment, this creates some potential ambiguity because it could lead to a question, if we're reading this in context, is it talking about a general right to be buried that extends even to criminals that we're putting to death? Or is it actually talking about an obligation that everyone must be buried? And this is not just a hypothetical question, it becomes very real if someone says, I don't want to be buried. Because if it's just a right, people could waive that right, but if it's an obligation, then it's an obligation. The halachic literature tends to come down on the side that it is an obligation. And we see that codified by the time of Maimonides and the medieval codes, as you can see at the bottom text on the second page of my handout from the Mishnah Torah. That's Maimonides' famous medieval code, Laws of Mourning, and he has a brief foray into talking about what things can a person decline. So a person can decline getting a eulogy, even though that is something that would usually be done in honor of the dead. If a person says to their relatives, I don't want to be eulogized, their relatives, should respect that. But Maimonides says if a person says, I don't want to be buried, we do not follow their wishes. That's not their choice. Now, I say all of this to give background. This is where the halachic literature has wound up. Even though, if you turn the page, we see a case where at least something like cremation is happening, even though it is culminating in burial, and it's clearly an act of respect. King Shaul his body has been claimed by the Philistines and put on display in 1 Samuel 31, and the men of Beit Sha'an sneak out, remove the body of King Shaul and his sons from where they're being displayed, and burn the bodies and bury them. And this is clearly construed as something that they're doing respectfully because they don't want their king's body left on display by the enemy. So again, Rabbi Ethan Tucker notes a couple of things about this. First of all, this may be a case where this was the best way to transport the body, and in certain cases of halachic literature, there is permission to use agents that hasten the decay or acids that cause the body to shrink and be more portable for the sake of ultimate burial. And yet it comes back to this question of the image of God and how we're treating it, and that there does remain a very strong taboo against burning a body entirely to ash. In the case of King Shaul, they buried his bones. They didn't burn his body entirely to ash. That said, people do choose cremation. In the halachic literature, there is a range from the voices of rabbis like Ethan Tucker who say the Jewish tradition is fairly clear that this is not the authorized choice. This is not the advisable choice. Yet Jews make choices that are not the authorized Jewish legal choices all the time, and we still consider them Jews, and we still mourn them when they die, and we still, sit Shiva for them. To voices like Rabbi Maurice Lamb, who wrote a few decades ago a book on Jewish death and mourning practices and said absolutely, cremation is so taboo that we do not even say Kaddish for people who choose to be cremated. From what I have read, there's not a whole lot to stand behind, with much respect, there's not a whole lot to stand behind Rabbi Maurice Lamb's opinion. And so I tend to fall on the side, such as it were, of Rabbi Ethan Tucker, which is, ideally, as a rabbi, in general, I like Jews to do mitzvot, and a Jew who chooses not to follow a given mitzvah is still a Jew and should still be treated as a Jew as much as possible in life and in death. And so when a member of our community chooses cremation, I'm never going to say, oh, great, that's fine. It's not fine with me, just like I'm never going to say when someone is like, Rabbi, I just don't think Shabbat is for me. I'm not going to say, great, that's fine either. But I'm also going to help make sure that they find an officiant for their memorial service, or I might officiate their memorial service. I'm going to certainly officiate their Shiva Minyanim and all of the other end-of-life rituals that we accord to the dignity of a deceased person. We're going to make sure here in this community that they get. I see that there's at least one question coming in over the chat.
The question is, you don't need to repeat it. Can you talk about Jewish thoughts on organ donation? I've heard that it is either a mitzvah or not at all allowed.
Okay. Great question. In case it didn't come through, the question was about Jewish thoughts on organ donation. Is it a mitzvah? There is one particular idea of the Jewish afterlife that suggests that someday the dead are going to be resurrected. They're going to roll underground until they reach Jerusalem, and then they're going to pop out of the ground in the city of Jerusalem and experience a judgment and kind of a jubilee there. And that when they do that, they're going to need their whole bodies intact for that. It's not the only understanding of the Jewish afterlife. There are a few, I would say, minority halachic opinions who are so attached to that understanding of the afterlife that they forbid organ donation. However, an increasingly mainstream Jewish opinion is that saving a life takes precedence over anything else. And should we be able in our death to save a life through organ donation, that is a mitzvah. Donation of the body to science, which is a little bit more of a corollary question, is a little bit more of a controversy because of a concern of how the body is going to be treated, what the research is going to be for, and if it's going to honor an image of God or defile an image of God. So I will say that that's a little bit more of an open question. In a community certainly such as ours, organ donation is not an open question. Organ donation is fully authorized and considered to be a mitzvah. I hope that answers the question. Good time for any other questions or reflections if people want to share. Gary. Okay. Yes. Gary asked me to speak about the last period as death is approaching, and I will do that in a minute, but I want to say just one more thing. There is a new process, somewhat controversial in contemporary halacha, called organic human reduction, also known as human composting. It has been in the last few years pioneered here on the West Coast. I think the first organization that's been doing it is located around Olympia, Washington. It is necessarily halachically controversial. However, it looks like we are moving towards a consensus, at least within the Reconstructionist Jewish community, that it is, for the purposes of human dignity, equivalent to burial, meaning what we would call an authorized form of dealing with the human body. For those who are interested, I didn't include any of this, but on Evolve Conversations, the sort of clearinghouse website for Reconstructionist sharing of philosophy, Rabbi Seth Goldstein, who's my colleague in Olympia, has written quite a bit about why this should be authorized and why we should consider this a legitimate way of dealing with the bodies. I was going to say one more thing about that. Give me a moment. So the other thing, I wanted to say another thing about cremation, which is that I think, it is hard for me to be clear how much the charge around cremation, when Rabbi Maurice Lamb writes that a Jew should never make this choice and shouldn't even be mourned as a Jew if they've made this choice, comes from the taboo after the Shoah. And because I think it has become more culturally charged since the Shoah, since Jewish bodies were burnt, and there becomes this ethos that is more cultural than halachic, that this is something a Jew should never choose to do to themselves, or should never allow to happen to another Jew. Which may or may not be compelling to you. But, you know, from a halachic perspective, I want to go back to, it's not a choice, you know, it is not the halachic choice, and it's not the choice that I would advise either halachically or, I want to say honestly, environmentally. The environmental benefits of cremation are generally overstated, and it's very resource intensive. It's not a necessarily more environmental choice. And so if people are considering cremation only because of the cost, the relative cost, they should know, watchers and listeners should know, that Jewish burial societies, Chevra Kadisha, all over the country, including in Portland, and to some extent, though we have less money here in Eugene, have funds for the purposes of allowing people who could otherwise not afford burial to afford burial if cost is the only differential that is determining the decision of cremation versus burial. If after all that, people listening are like, you know what, I really want to be cremated, again, it's one among many Jewish choices you will make in your life and death, and my position is it's not one that I'm going to authorize and say, yay, mazel tov, but we will make sure that you are treated as a Jew with the full respect of a Jew, no matter what choice you make at that point in your Jewish life and death. Some people do ask about what to be buried in, and I just wanted to show the proof text. It's the last one on my document for our practice that people are buried in plain pine caskets. It's an agadah, meaning a Talmudic story. It's framed as a story, not as a law, though it does wind up having the status of law. That it's for the sake of the dignity of the poor. That it used to be that funerals were an opportunity for keeping up with the Joneses. And that people would bankrupt themselves to make sure to have really, really lavish funerals and honor their deceased. And it got to such a point where Rabban Gamliel, who at his time was the head of the Jewish community, decided to forego his own dignity and set an example of just being buried in a plain pine box, so that that would be the standard and no one would have to keep up. And to this day, the idea of Jewish burial is that we don't do a whole lot of adornment. We don't bury in fancy satin caskets, but in plain pine boxes, in simple shrouds. And that, you know, ultimately we are all going back to the same place with the same stuff. Okay, so I haven't forgotten your question, Gary, that you want to talk about the before death, these last moments of life. But first, before we move on to there, I want to see if there are any other questions. Yes, Abby. So Abby is asking about shroud versus no shroud and what we are buried wearing. So if you tune in next week when the Chevra Kadisha presents, or it's not a continuation of the Federation program, but a little bit of an epilogue that is being put on by the Chevra Kadisha in 2 weeks, a little bit more of a full program answering questions about our Chevra Kadisha, our burial society. They will be sharing and handing out TBI's end-of-life wishes form, which is something that any member of our community and non-member who is marginally affiliated with our community can fill out and leave on file with the TBI office so that we know what you want when you pass away. And the form very conveniently shows a little Jewish star-shaped asterisk that indicates which choices are the traditional Jewish choices and which are not. So like, for example, you can say, I've made plans to be buried, or I've made plans to be cremated. And you can say, I would like to be buried in these clothes, or I'd like to be buried in shrouds provided by the community. It is, for the same reason as the simple pine casket, the traditional choice to accept to be buried in tachrichim, in simple, undyed linen shrouds. And we do have a group of volunteers who make them here at TBI. So it's not something that you need to buy online. And related to that, another choice people can choose to accept or decline is to have tahara, literally purification, done over their bodies. Tahara is a practice of a group of people, usually anonymous strangers, who gather to ritually wash the body of the deceased and recite prayers and psalms over them as they very reverentially wash the body, and usually culminates in dressing the body in the shroud and preparing the body to be placed in the casket. So, by the way, Tahara and Chaver Kadisha are both on your vocabulary list, so if I use those again without defining them, you can look there. So when a person is near death, to go back to Gary's question, but not yet dying, there are a couple of mitzvot that apply to all of us. It is a mitzvah to do bikur cholim. It's a mitzvah to visit the sick. It is a mitzvah to pray for the sick when we visit the sick. There's a traditional prayer referred to as Misha Berach. It's the third item on the vocabulary list. It just refers to the first two words of the traditional prayer formula that usually opens a prayer for the ill. But there's a common misconception that Jews don't do spontaneous prayer. Jews do spontaneous prayer. It's fine to do spontaneous prayer. If you're visiting someone who is sick and near death and you just want to pray for them in English, whatever prayer is in your heart, go for it. That's great. It's a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah to visit the sick. It's a mitzvah to pray for the healing of the sick up until essentially the time that they are goses. Now, when we say healing, that means healing of body, healing of mind, healing of spirit, healing of relationships. I always ask people when I visit them what they would like me to pray for. Some people would like me to pray for their recovery. Some people would like me to pray for slowing their illness if it's a terminal chronic illness and they want more time. And some people want, freedom from pain or reconciliation. So it's a great opportunity to reflect on what people authentically need before us in that moment. When death gets close to imminent, there is a practice, it may be familiar to you from Yom Kippur, called vidui, literally confession. This is also on your vocabulary list. And I do invite people to do it if they would like, when it seems that they're very near death. It is an act of final confession, using some of the same liturgy of confession that we recite on Yom Kippur. And it includes the aspiration that our death make atonement for anything that we did not manage to atone for in life, which is consonant with Jewish tradition. In the Talmud, in Masechet Yoma, in Masechet Yom Kippur, it says Yom Kippur and death are the two best ways to atone for our sins. So there is an idea in Jewish tradition that whatever we don't manage to atone for in life, our death itself will atone for. And the act of making vidui right before we die is an opportunity to sort of get that clean slate. The traditional vidui prayers also include a hope that, like, and if I recover, great, may I also have atoned. So the idea of making vidui and possibly having a miraculous or less miraculous recovery are not mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean like I'm committed to dying now. I'm going to jump there to talk about, I think it's very related to the spiritual tasks of a person who is near death. This is what I always advise people who are close to dying. This is not based specifically in Jewish tradition, although we can relate it to things in Jewish tradition like vidui. This is more based in my training as a hospice chaplain. There are really 4 things that a person who is dying, according to hospice philosophy, needs to make sure they have gotten clear with the people around them. And this is at the very bottom and back of your vocabulary sheet. Thing number 1 is thank you, although some people frame it as I love you. Just expressing appreciation and love to those that you love. Thing number 2 is asking for forgiveness, which means apologizing, in case that's not clear, but acknowledging any wrongdoing and requesting forgiveness. Thing number 3 is acknowledging hurts and offering forgiveness. And then you say goodbye. And make sure, for the person who is dying, request permission to go. Or, depending on how it is, say like, and I'm really ready to go. And for the loved one, as we talked about with the story of Yehuda Hanasi and his death, and how hard it can be to die when there are people in the room, when I am counseling family members of a terminally ill person who is in a lot of pain, and the family members are saying like, I really don't like seeing them suffering. I wish they knew it was okay to go. I always say, well, have you told them that it's okay to go? Don't underestimate the power of a loved one giving someone permission to go. Even if they are no longer responsive, no longer verbal, habits of caregiving and of worrying about our loved ones die really hard. Sorry, no pun intended. It's really important. If you're with someone who is dying, whether or not they've done these tasks out loud, you can do them with them, even if they are no longer responsive, and it will help them go, I believe, from what I have seen. Heavy. It's probably a good pause point for now, before I go into some of the morning practices, just to see if there's reflections or follow-up questions on any of this stuff. Yes, Patty?
Please put me in my prom dress or whatever they want to be buried in. Can those things go together?
Yeah, so the question is about various Jewish ritual end-of-life practices. Tahara, the shrouds, can a person, choose to receive tahara but get buried in a cocktail dress? Can a person choose to not receive tahara but still get a Jewish burial? The answer, it depends who you ask. In our Reconstructionist community, absolutely. Our Hevra Kadisha is very committed to giving people as much of the traditional Jewish burial ritual as they would like. And that includes, actually, if a person opts to be cremated, but wants their body prepared with tahara before it gets sent to be cremated, our Hevra Kadisha will do that as well. Do the two members of our Hever Kadisha who are present want to add anything to that answer? Or did I cover it?
Yes. I do. Okay, thanks. Yes, and we have often done that. Right, that somebody requested many times.
They've often taken an outfit that someone has requested to be buried in if they didn't want to be buried in shrouds,
Right,
and
many
dressed
times.
the deceased in that.
And the other thing I wanted to say about plain pine boxes, it's not required. I mean, as most probably know, in Israel, it's very common to be buried just, they may be transported in a plain pine box to the cemetery, and then the body wrapped in a shroud is lowered into the earth, into the grave. That's very common. And in Oregon, we have a lot of people at the Masonic Cemetery who have chosen just that.
So we do have local cemeteries that will allow people to
Oh,
be buried
yes.
without
Oh,
caskets.
yes,
Okay, I
yes.
did not realize that.
Yes, and
That's great. In many other states, it's illegal to be buried not in a
no,
casket. Right.
and concrete liners, but Masonic is fine. I think Oak Hill, the older pioneer cemeteries, which of course are full of.
I believe we've negotiated with Musgroves that they don't require the liner,
Right.
although
right,
they do require the casket.
Right, but anyhow, in Oregon, it's not required. And
Great.
there's one more thing I wanted to say about shrouds. There are many different customs about how to do the shrouds. Our Hever Kadisha, decades ago, decided to simplify it, kind of going from the idea of Rabbi Gamliel, that instead of a multi-piece shroud that's different for men and different for women, to make it appear to be like the high priest on Yom Kippur, we made a very simple, one-size-fits-all, one simple plain, kind of like a kaftan or a robe, and more open in the back like a hospital gown, so that there's less handling of the body, and it felt more respectful, and also one doesn't have to take into account any gender differences, gender preferences. It's that sense of simplicity, honoring the person, and we are very fortunate that we have people in town who are, that's one of their wonderful contributions, is willing to make them with great love and respect. And so some other communities have followed that. When we went to conferences, they were like, oh, wow, great.
That's
all I
great,
wanted to say.
Libby. Thank you for sharing. And does our Hever Kadisha often get requests for people to be buried in a kittel? So a kittel, for those who are not familiar with it, is a garment, historically, traditionally worn by men, but I have one too. If you're a member of TBI, you've seen me wearing mine on Yom Kippur. That is often acquired and worn for the first time at one's wedding, and then worn every Yom Kippur, and then a person will sometimes be buried in that as well. And a talit, people can opt to be wrapped in their talit for burial as well. Yes, Leslie.
I've had people ask me about sanctified ground, like they found a burial plot they like that's outside of the Jewish area. Can they get just that plot sanctified? What's the process about it? And what is it all?
Depends. So it's a great question. Does a Jew have to be buried in sanctified ground that is sanctified as a Jewish burial site? The answer is depends who you're asking. The Orthodox halachic answer is yes. A Jew should be buried only in a Jewish cemetery, surrounded by Jews. The Orthodox answer would also mean a halachic definition of who is a Jew. Whole other conversation. To the point that if a Jewish person is buried in unsanctified ground, the Orthodox position will be that they should be disinterred and their body moved to a Jewish cemetery. In our community, in part because even our Jewish cemeteries, we actually do not guarantee that you will only be buried among Jews, because we do in our community allow non-Jewish spouses to be buried with their partners in our Jewish cemeteries. The distinction, therefore, between the ground that we have sanctified and unsanctified ground is not quite as cut and dry. So, for example, I myself will officiate over burials in non-authorized places. I've done burials in Pioneer Cemetery, which doesn't have a Jewish section, or in sections of Masonic Cemetery that are not the Jewish section. So, I hope that's a complete answer.
Is it possible to make the ground sanctified? Like, is it a blessing, or what is it that makes that
So
ground?
there is a way that we dedicate a cemetery as Jewish space, but ultimately it is about Jewish particularism. The traditions around sanctifying Jewish cemeteries are about Jews being buried with other Jews. So the concept of like a single plot Jewish cemetery is kind of as impossible as the concept of like a single person minyan. Go ahead.
I have a question. My mom, when we were at her funeral, she had like a net over her face that we didn't know about, or I didn't know about it. And what is the significance of that? Is it an Orthodox thing? Because my mom wasn't Orthodox.
So the question is, the questioner's mother had a net over her face at their funeral. I'm surprised that you saw it, because usually,
Saw her. Yeah, but then in the service, she
yes. Anyway, okay. So traditionally, shrouds do cover the face. Right.
Generally, what we do is the sauve, which is basically a white sheet kind of on a diagonal, put of your wood coffin. Then the last part comes over their face. But there are many varieties of Orthodox shrouds that do include a kind of cap that, cover the face. But there are many different
So,
customs.
but just to answer your question, if this person was if your mother was enshrouded by a Chevra Kadisha, by a Jewish burial society, probably in some way or another the garments that they had did include a facial covering. Oh, interesting.
Can I just say I had
You
a
can
similar
share a
experience?
guess.
Because the tradition is to not look upon the face, then it was a combination, not traditional or Orthodox, but she was in her own clothing, they were doing an open casket for the family, but they honored that tradition. Could that be an
It
explanation?
could absolutely be. As you can see, there's a lot of variability even within and certainly among Jewish communities, especially non-Orthodox Jewish communities. Malka, you had a question, right? Okay, if it comes back, you can ask it. Let's briefly talk about after death and mourning. So traditionally, there are defined categories of a mourner. And according to Jewish law, one is a mourner for one's parents primarily. That's the most intensive mourning because that's a relationship that, at least according to traditional thinking, is unique and can never be replaced. You know, there's only going to be two people who begat you. And one is also a mourner for one's siblings, spouse, and chas v'chalila, God forbid, child, if one's child predeceases. So for the first part of mourning, that looks identical no matter who died. The period from when one finds out about the death until actual burial is referred to as aninut. It's very intensive mourning, and it is characterized essentially by a suspension of expectations of conforming to normal behavior. So when a person is in that first shock of grief, in traditional halachic literature, that would mean they're exempt from praying the daily liturgy. But, you know, we can also say sort of more psycho-halachically in terms of thinking how this might apply to ourselves, that a person in this period, in this first shock of grief, you know, probably should not be expected to return phone calls, probably should not be expected to be polite to people. Aninut ends and Shiva begins, traditionally with the burial, which traditionally takes place as immediately as possible, within 48 hours of death. Obviously, nowadays, it often takes a lot longer if people are opting for burial, and that can kind of mess with the way these rituals work. But Shiva is the 7-day mourning period that begins the day of the funeral. So it's not the funeral plus another 7 days. It's the funeral day is day one. The burial day is day one. And is characterized by the mourners laying low at home. And quite literally, in traditional Shiva households, the mourners will be sitting on cushions on the floor, on low-backed chairs as a signal of their mourning. If there's one thing I really wish progressive Jewish communities understood, it is that mourners in a Shiva household do not have the obligation to entertain. So I talk to people all the time who are in mourning and who are preparing for their Shiva minyanim and are asking, like, how much bagels and lox they should order. And no. It is the community's job to take care of the mourner, which means ideally, community, you're not just bringing them coffee cake because a mourner can't live on coffee cake, but you're bringing them healthy food to feed them for a week that they're in Shiva. And you don't go to a Shiva house hungry. You don't go to a Shiva house looking forward to all the delicious snacks that you're going to get to eat. So Shiva is a time for the mourner to stay at home, accept condolences from the community. Community, if we advertise a Shiva minyan, meaning you get an email saying so-and-so is deceased and our condolences, Zichrono livracha, may their memory be for blessing, and the Shiva will be at a certain time and place, that means you're invited. Even if you didn't know the deceased and or you don't know the mourner. If the mourner has consented to the Shiva being publicly advertised, it is a mitzvah to go, even if you don't bring food. Because the point of Shiva is for the community to show up and take care of someone who is in mourning. You don't have to have the right thing to say. In fact, one of the obligations of a visitor in a Shiva house is not to initiate conversation unless the mourner speaks to you first. You go, you stand silently and supportively. If the mourner speaks to you, you say, I'm so sorry for your loss. You say amen to the blessings. You help make a minyan for the prayers. And you don't have to solve a person's grief. You don't have to know the right thing to say. It's a mitzvah to show up. It's one of the hardest things for people in progressive Jewish community, but that's why I wanted to make sure to say it. Some mourners, and it's very culturally understandable with how our society is right now, are not comfortable with allowing strangers into their house. So those mourners, you're not going to see an invitation to a Shiva house. You're not going to see an invitation to the Shiva advertised. But for those who do consent to have it advertised, know that it is a mitzvah to show up. Show up, don't come hungry, bring healthy food, don't say too much unless the mourner talks to you, and you will be fine. MyJewishLearning.com has some great articles on what to do and what not to do in a Shiva house if you're anxious and you want to know more. After Shiva ends, on the seventh morning of Shiva, it's traditional for the mourners to leave the house and take a walk around the block as a sort of symbolically rejoining the land of the land of the living. And then they will slowly begin to re-engage in life. They'll go back to work. They'll go back to social interactions. It is traditional during Shloshim to refrain from things like getting a haircut, wearing new clothes, attending large celebratory events. And for parents, those mourning practices continue traditionally the first year of mourning. Or in the case of a haircut, this is actually very cute. The halachic literature says, until your friends say, you're looking really unkempt, it's time for you to get a haircut. Then a person can get a haircut even if they're still in their first year of mourning. So obviously, in our community, not everybody observes Shiva for Shiva. Shiva is literally from the root Sheva, meaning 7 days. But often our members will opt for 1 day of Shiva, 2 days of Shiva, maybe 3, and then want to get on with their lives. That's in part because of that lag between death and burial that we have now. So it's more time has passed by the time Shiva starts often in our community than in what the traditional Jewish rituals are imagining. I always like to tell people, if you don't have to rush, don't rush. Jewish culture is very good at grief and making space for grief. Our wider surrounding culture is not. So give yourself the gift of as much Shiva as you can, if it's something you can, is my rabbinic, probably not terribly surprising perspective on the question. And then the next major milestone in mourning is the year mark. So for a parent, a person will say Kaddish typically for the first 11 months. That's because of a tradition that the recitation of Kaddish helps the soul purify itself and ultimately make it into heaven. And the longest it can take for a soul to get to heaven is a year. And no one wants to be the one to assume that their parents are the ones who took the whole year. So we say out of respect for the goodness of the dead, we stop Kaddish after 11 months. But a person is still traditionally in mourning until the completion of the year. And then the Yartzeit in Yiddish, or, oh, if Monique were here, she would tell me the word. I think the word is Nahala in Ladino is the Sephardi word for it, is the 1 year anniversary, and then the continuing anniversary of death, where traditional practices of grief will be observed, such as lighting a Yartzeit candle, making sure to be in a minyan and say Kaddish, maybe donating to tzedakah in honor of the loved one. There's also 4 times a year, besides the Yartzeit, where traditionally someone who has lost one of those primary halachic relationships, parents, spouse, sibling, child, will say Yizker, will say special memorial prayers for the dead, and those are recited in the synagogue in community on Yom Kippur, Shmini Atzeret at the end of Sukkot, the end of Pesach, and the second day in the diaspora of Shavuot. So I'm going to pause there and see if there's other things people want to ask about or share. Malka. Okay, Malka said one word, Gehenna, which is a Jewish word that, is a Hebrew word that can be loosely translated as hell. I'm going to take your question as a larger invitation to talk about the afterlife. We do not have a defined idea of hell in Judaism. The word Gehenna actually comes from the Hebrew Gaichinom, which is a place, a valley in Jerusalem, where they think like bones were historically tossed. As I said, there is a conception that when Jews die, there is some sort of process of purification that their souls go through as they do Aliyat HaNeshama, the ascension of the soul, and get to Olam Haba, the world to come. We don't know what Olam Haba looks like. The rabbis of the Talmud said, we're just studying Torah nourished by Ziv HaShechina, the golden light of God's presence, which may or may not sound appealing to you. However, there is not a Jewish concept of like an eternal place of torment that is analogous to hell, at least not in like traditional Jewish sources. There are agadot, there's like Talmudic stories of like wandering souls that haven't made their aliyah yet, and what needs to happen, who needs to say Kaddish, what tzedakah needs to be given in their memory for them to get there. But we don't have a concept of like eternal torment. Thank goodness. Patty, go ahead.
There isn't also a heaven, but rather you live on in the hearts of the living. That has served me well for 75 years. Is it accurate?
It is definitely the case that the most consistent things we talk about when we talk about the dead are their legacies on earth. That doesn't mean there isn't a Jewish concept of afterlife. As I mentioned, the Talmud is full of references to Olam Haba, the world to come. There's a very famous essay by Maimonides about his introduction to Perek Chelek, his introduction to the chapter about that says all of Israel have a share in the world to come. Great discussion that then immediately says, except for these people, and these people, and these people. But in principle, all of Israel have a share in the world to come. So that is a live and pretty undefined concept. We also see, as I mentioned, this concept of like resurrection and messianic time. So there's definitely Jewish conceptions of afterlife of our individual souls and possibly in conjunction with our individual bodies. But, you know, as you've probably heard me mention, if we look at biblical benedictions and curses, they're really all about this world, right? Like reward and punishment, such as we conceive of it in Judaism, is not about being good so much so that we can get a reward elsewhere, but is being good for the sake of this world and like, you know, that you and your children and your children's children may prosper in the land. In the time of the Talmud, the conversations do shift to, you know, studying Torah because it will give us nourishment in this world and it will also give us reward in the world to come. And so the concept of reward in the world to come does get more discussed in the Talmud. And I wonder, as a Reconstructionist rabbi who has a historical perspective, if that is because the Talmud is a diasporic document. And so having the reward of our children and our children's children prospering in the land was not an option for the Talmudic rabbis who were in exile in Babylon. So they looked more towards a reward in the world to come. But that is, I hope, a comprehensive, if not particularly definitive answer. Yes, Michael.
A chat question is, what is it that is promised at the end of Psalm 133?
Oh my goodness. Whoever asked that question assumes that I have more of the Bible memorized than I do. No, 133, that's not on my document. So I'd have to look at a Tanakh. Perhaps the person who asks the question wants to put in the chat, what is it that is promised at the end of 133? What Psalm 133 is, I believe, the psalm that opens, Hine matovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. But that is not the end of it. I think Abby may have just gone to get me a Tanakh. Ugh. I know where Psalms are in the Bible. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be able to find it. Proverbs, Psalms. It is Hine Matova Manayim. Ketach Hermon Shirad al Hayit Zion Kisham Sivadonai et Habracha Chaim Ad Olam. I see. So Psalm 133 says, their God commanded the blessing Chaim Ad Olam, which can be translated as life forever, everlasting life. So I assume the questioner is sort of saying, you know, how do we interpret this? Christians would obviously interpret this as a reference to eternal life through Jesus. I'm not going to say the Christian reading is wrong. It's clearly right for billions of Christians in the world. However, I would say the Jewish reading is much more probably an environmental and of this world reading. That this mountain, this place you live, will be a flourishing, blossoming place forever. That's my take on it. Go for it, Abby. I'll wait for the microphone.
Somewhat of a segue into sanctified ground. My grandfather, when he immigrated to this country, he had some earth from Eretz Israel, and he was supposed to have that buried with him, and he kept it on him because what if something happened? So I don't know, is that still done? I'm assuming in Israel, probably not, but where and how, I'm interested.
It is still part of the traditional Jewish practice to be buried with dirt from Eretz Yisrael. And we do that. We have that. So even in Eugene, Oregon, you can be buried with a few grains of dirt from Eretz Yisrael. And sometimes pottery shards on the eyes. No?
Sorry. What I understood was the reason, but maybe it's not. But we're talking about Olam Haba, and when the Messiah comes, if you your head, then you'll get to go back to Jerusalem. Is that part
Yes,
of it,
it's part of the whole ethos of the rolling. That dirt in your coffin will help orient you to where you're rolling to. But if you don't believe that your bodies are going to roll, and you still want the practice of a little bit of dirt from Eretz Yisrael to connect you to the sanctified land of the Jewish people, that's a great reason too.
I have a couple comments. One is going back to when you did such a wonderful job explaining, okay, for 7 days there's this, and 30 days, and so on, all the anniversary times. And there's something I wanted to say, which is a lot of people have this idea that you don't put up a monument marker. I'm talking pretty loud. Okay. After a year, but actually the tradition is anytime after burial. And often for many people, before that year is done because, as you were saying about saying cottage.
So Libby's wanting to clarify, just for those who can't hear, often Jews believe that the matzeva, the headstone, if there's going to be one, should be erected after the first year, and that is not true. The actual tradition is that it is erected anytime between shloshim, between the end of the first month, and ideally before the completion of a year. What was the next thing you wanted to say?
The other comment I had is that for those people who are interested in reading a really long but fascinating book about Jewish views of the afterlife, I would recommend Rabbi Simcha Paul Raphael's book, which recently came out in its 3rd edition. It's probably 500 pages or something. And it starts from the earliest history through various civilizations among whom the people of Israel have been lived with and had influence by, up to modern psychology.
What is the title of the book?
Jewish Views of the Afterlife.
So Libby is recommending a book
excellent.
by Rabbi Simcha Paul Raphael, Jewish Views of the Afterlife. Okay. Awesome. Any other questions? I don't know if I should go into, what you can expect if you're in from the TBI community. I think that's what the Chevra Kadisha is going to talk about next week in greater depth. But just know our Chevra Kadisha, our burial society, is entirely volunteer run and will provide services for people who are dying and people who are in mourning in our community, regardless of if they are members of Temple Beth Israel, including arranging for all of helping arrange the logistics and coordination with funeral homes, burial, tahara, as well as, for those who desire, actually arranging the services, Shiva Minyanim, helping with meals, again, regardless of whether or not one is a member of Temple Beth Israel. So people should know that that is a very high value of any Jewish community, including our own. Yes, Malka.
Not if you need to get something done or buried. You got it. I mean, okay. Anyway, I don't want to forget what I was going to say.
I know our community is very small, so
Ugh.
I will just say Temple Beth Israel has 3 dedicated cemetery spaces. The one we're currently recommending because of cost and availability is Musgrove's Mortuary, West Lawn Cemetery on West 11th and South Danebo Road. We have a dedicated Jewish cemetery space in Masonic Cemetery, which is unfortunately very full. There may be a few spaces left. About 7, says Abby. Okay, and there are spaces in Musgroves where that permit the burial of cremains. Sorry, there are spaces in Masonic that permit the burial of cremains. Malka, did you remember your question?
Yeah, gatekeepers. Do we have any gatekeepers here?
Do we have what?
Gatekeepers? Like someone who stays with the body?
So unfortunately, so the question is, do we have shomrim, guardians, who do shmira, which is a traditional end of life, or which is a traditional practice that between death and burial, the body should not be left alone. We actually used to, on our end of life wishes form, have the option of people to request shmira. We took it off the form because our community is small and we did not have the volunteer person power, especially given how long it can take for burial to provide volunteers to sit with a body without stopping for 3 days or 4 days. That said, if a person does really want shmira, I know our Chevra Kadisha will work with the family to try to recruit people, but it's not something that we can guarantee. And I was not going to mention the third place since we're not really recommending them very much anymore. Yes, and we don't recommend it, so I wasn't going to name it to not recommend it.
There's another consideration about the Shmira, and that is it's very difficult for the funeral homes. And in fact, it's many of them have insurance that forbids them from having other people in where the bodies are kept for extended periods of time. And I know Musgroves will accommodate that as best they can while there's an employee there, but they can't have someone there overnight. So there's a legal issue with the funeral
okay.
home.
So the restriction on our capacity to do shmira is not just about the capacity of the Chevra Kadisha, but it's about the nature of working in a city where we don't have a Jewish funeral home and a Jewish cemetery.
And there's another factor, and we'll talk about this next week as well, and that is it's possible to do it conceptually, to conceptually be with the person, the body, the spirit, without actually physically being there. If we were in the funeral home, we would be sitting in front of a refrigerator, and there'll be a lot of other bodies in the refrigerator, so it's not like you could actually sit with the body and accompany the body.
So the Chevra Kadisha could help organize for people who want a conceptual shmira, for example, to have rotations of people who are saying psalms, on 2-hour rotations in their own homes or somewhere else that they gather, even if they can't get into the funeral home or can't be in the funeral home at all times. And friends, keep in mind our time is short, and there will be time for the Chevra Kadisha next week. So particularly if there are questions that are not about the specific Chevra Kadisha practices, I could probably take one more before we close. Yes? Kriya. Okay, I did not talk about Kriya, Gary is reminding me. That is the practice traditionally of tearing one's clothing as soon as you've heard the news of the demise of a loved one. Interestingly, the literature discusses what should one do if one hears about the demise of a loved one, weeks or months after they died, and the answer is one should tear Kriya and sit Shiva, as, effective then. In our community, sometimes people do opt to tear their clothes. Sometimes people opt to accept the black ribbon that the funeral home will offer them and pin it to their clothing, usually on the left side over the heart for a parent, on the right side for any of the other relationships. And, excuse me. And we do that typically right before gathering for a funeral or for burial. Now, I do want to say, I mentioned earlier, the traditional relationships of mourning are parent, child, spouse, sibling. That does not mean that in our community we exclude people from identifying as mourners in other relationships. We acknowledge there's various different kinds of chosen family in this day and age and community, and someone might be a mourner who needs to do Kriya and sit Shiva, even if they do not have one of those specifically defined relationships with the deceased. Grandparent, grandchild is not an official relationship of mourning. It's common if I were at a funeral that I would offer to the grandchildren to tear Kriya. But, consider also the relationship of mourning is traditionally a relationship of obligation, not necessarily privilege. It's not about when the halachic literature is talking about who's a mourner, they're not really talking about who gets to tear Kriya and say Kaddish. They're talking about who's obligated to refrain from joyful activities for a year or for a month and say Kaddish every day. So the halachic literature doesn't necessarily, out of humanity, doesn't necessarily want to expand the list of people who are obligated to identify as mourners. And it is very true that the way a grandchild might, the impact that the loss of a grandparent might tend to have on a grandchild is very different in terms of capacity, inclination to engage with the wider world, 2 months later, say, than the impact of the loss of a spouse, a child, a sibling, a parent. Of course, that does not mean that that is always the case. So again, we give people the right to self-define as mourners. Maimonides says converts to Judaism should mourn their parents, should mourn their biological parents, which is actually an open question in the halachic literature because of all of the discourse about conversion as rebirth. Nonetheless, he says, converts should honor their parents who gave them life when they die. I always say, again, from sort of a more psychological perspective, yes, you should mourn your parents, but if your parents were Baptists who were not okay with you converting to Judaism and they wouldn't be okay with you saying Kaddish for them, maybe find a different way to mourn them. It's a complicated thing, but just know that's a live question and conversation that we can have in our community as well. I think our time is up, right? Well, thank you all for engaging. I hope this was helpful. Thank you again to the Jewish Federation of Lane County, and particularly to Social Services Coordinator Leslie Griffel for organizing all of this.